There is a race of fairy creatures, a fae folk, in the far north of Scotland, on the Isles of Orkney and Shetland, magical islands with the most beautiful scenery, full of stunning views, beaches that are tropical but untouched and unspoiled. Stone circles are everywhere, archaeological sites are many, and the folklore is vast and varied. These were places that the Viking explorers came and settled and farmed, and brought their stories too, and their culture, of course. The Huldu folk, their fairy folk, came with them, and they also settled. In this snippet of folklore, I am going to talk a little of the Trows, creatures that settled with these Vikings as trolls and evolved. There are also sea Trows, but this time I shall tell you of the Trows that live on the land, the hill Trows, and only a little of the folklore, as there is so much written about these curious little fellows. The Trows are mischievous creatures, short, ugly and rather shy. They are nocturnal folk who live in the hollow hills and mounds known as Trowinos, and at night they often come out of these homes and into human ones, slipping quietly through the house. There are some strange customs associated with the Trows, but one that raises an eyebrow was told to a man once. Some of the older folk in the community had told him that if he washed his face with the first egg of a chicken, he would be able to see the Trows. The man did this, but the Trows, they knew he saw them too, so they gave chase, and they chased him until they could chase no more. Another peculiar tale says that should a woman see a Trow, it will walk backwards away, never once taking an eye off the watching woman, although it has also been said that they will back away from anyone who can see them in this way, sometimes even skipping backwards and not merely walking. There is a species of Trow in the folklore of Shetland called the Kunal Trow, the King Trow. This is a race with no females in it at all. They are lonely. They are sometimes heard weeping for their lack of a mate. Once in their lives they may take a human wife, yet sadly this woman will die after giving birth, and always to a son. This meant then that the Trow had to kidnap another woman as a wet nurse. These creatures are believed to eat earth that they have formed into the shapes of fish and birds, sometimes even human babies. In an act of magic, these earthen shapes are believed to taste of the real thing to the Trows. There is a stone circle on the Isle of Thekla known as the Hjaltadans, which means limping dance. And this strange one-legged hopping type dance is the Henking. It is said that this stone circle is a group of Trows turned into stone. The Henky dance is a strange thing indeed, and so popular is it with the Trows that many places have Henk or Henky in their names on these islands, places where the Trows were known to gather and dance. The Henky dance was said to comprise of the Trows looping instead of walking. They would squat to their knees, almost doubled in front, hands held tight between their thighs and calves, and then hopping around on one leg like this. It is a very dangerous thing to approach a Trowy Henking. A man of the Isle of Fetlar once saw the Trows dancing this way, and he began an argument with them. One of the creatures picked up a heather stalk and threw it at him. It hit the heel of his foot, and to the end of his days he was lame in that same foot. The Trows love music and dancing. Many a tale tells of how sometimes they will kidnap musicians or tempt them into the Trowy knowes. Some fiddlers have heard the music of the Trows, the Trowy tunes, and they have remembered them, and some have even recorded the tunes they remember, and these tunes you can still hear to this day. As with all fairy dances and music, it is wise to be very, very cautious. The temptation to join the revels can be more than we humans can bear. Better to be careful and step away. There was a fellow who saw a procession of Trows at the Trowy Glen on the Isle of Hoy. Curious about these small creatures, he followed them halfway down the glen to a cave. On entering the cave, he found himself in a splendidly decorated room, and a dance was underway. The king of these beings came to talk to him, saying he should have had permission to enter their realm, and yet he would allow it. He was offered ale made from the heather. He drank and he joined the dancing. All was well until he lit his pipe and breathed out the sickly sweet smoke. The small Trows turned pale, one after another, falling to the floor of the hall. The last to do this was the king. In a flash, the man found himself sat outside a rabbit burrow, not a single trow or entrance to a cave in sight. In another true tale, a fiddler named Tam Bicken said how he had met a man, a trow clothed all in grey, a long grey beard and dark, bright, mischievous eyes. This creature invited him to play for himself and his friends. Tam Bicken followed the strange man through a door that had appeared in the side of the high mound of Dingishow. They followed a long steep tunnel into a huge room in the earth. The trow now gave Tam heather ale, which stupidly he drank. A fatal thing indeed. That night he played his fiddle as he had never played before. Tam was like a man possessed. When all of the revels were finally over, and he was allowed to leave, Tam Bicken found many years had passed by, and yet for him, time had stood still. He had not aged one single day. This is a common theme, and one I talk about in another episode of Folk Tales, the dangers of fairy music and dancing. The Trows of the hills are said to be able to adopt a size close to that of humans, although many people see them as smaller folk. They can shift size and age as most fairy races can. They are known to wear grey, such as in one tale told of two men passing by the fairy rings on the Isle of Unst on a midsummer's night. Sat on the pile of stones that had once been the altar of the stone circle there was a grey trow, muttering to himself in a strange dialect they could not understand. The same folklorist collected another tale of two young grey-clothed trow boys stealing a cow and running off a cliff with it. The trow boys had left a semblance of that cow where it had been stood, as with changelings. The mimic cow died not long after. A young girl once saw a little grey woman trow wandering the hill that she was on, as though searching for something she had lost, muttering in an exasperated way to herself in her own secret language. It took all day for the boys and girls that were gathered there to gather the courage to approach her. They had watched her all day. Towards sunset, one little brave girl decided she would be the one to talk to the Trow woman. The sun was setting as she approached the little grey figure. Something caught the child's eye and she looked away for but 1 second, and on turning back to where the Trow woman had been, there was nothing there. It was also accepted that should a Trow be caught above ground as the sun rose, it would not be able to return to its Trowie knowe. The poor Trow must stay exposed in the light of day, hiding until sunset would allow them back into the hill. The Trows are thieves, known thieves, greedy, and cannot help themselves if they see something they want, but only if it means stealing from humans. It is forbidden for them in their culture to ever steal from their own kind. To do this would bring doom to the Trow thief, as is told in one tale of a young Trow boy who stole a silver spoon from one of the king Trows. This boy was judged and banished from all Trow society forever. His fate would be to wander the lonely places all by himself, always alone. Once a year at Yule, he would be allowed to visit his people, but all he got every time he returned was a swift beating and food comprised of eggshells. The poor Trow boy could be seen spending his days wandering aimlessly through the aisles, dressed in his grey tattered rags, weeping inconsolably. Now, let's have a look at some examples of encounters with the Trows from Shetland and Orkney, true tales told over the years. There was a man who, in the twilight, found by his home in the yard a strange box, created from wattle of straw. It looked a little like a case made for a fiddle, so he took it back into his home and placed it on top of the box bed. Having work to do, he went to the byre to give his cattle their food. On coming back from feeding his animals, he could hear strange noises, noisy footsteps striding here and there, and a strange wailing. A little voice came from the box he had found. It begged to be let out as his mother was crying for him. The man realized what he had found, a Trow child for some reason in a box. He quickly took the case and placed it gently outside on the ground, and all went silent as the Trow mother and child were reunited. There was a farmer on whose land there sat a brook. He decided one day to investigate this place, open it up and see what he could find there. In the ruin he excavated ashes and bones, kitchen scraps and shells, and realized that this was a burial site. One day as he was working at the place, an old man appeared, bearded and dressed all in grey tatters and patches. In his shriveled hand he held an old hat. Around his feet were pieces of hide tied with strips of skin. He spoke to the farmer, telling him this was his ruin, warning him that should he trespass any more in that place, he would come to regret ever touching it in the first place. 6 cattle would die, he told the farmer, and then 6 funerals would be held by the farmer's own family. And so it was. But all of this that the Trow spoke came to pass. On an evening in Walls, an old woman was walking her dog. The hillside was dark, and her dog caught sight of something which it decided to chase. The old woman hurried after her dog as fast as she could. At the hillside, she saw an incredible sight. There was a doorway, and bright light streamed from the doorway. She could see it was a Trowie house, warm and homely. There were many Trows in there, Henking to their music. Nearby the doorway stood a Trow wife washing a dish. The astonished woman watched as the Trow wife drove her escaped dog from the hill. Suddenly, the music stopped, and the woman, the light, and the door vanished. All was dark once more on the hill. There was a man who was a tinker, selling dishes door to door all over the islands, and so it was his life to travel around. One day, on passing a Trowino, a mound, he noticed a door in the mound, and a small dark man stood watching him. The little man asked after what the old tinker, old Mac, had for sale. This he told the strange little man. He had plates, bowls, cups and saucers, and some chamber pots too. Magically he found himself inside the hill, in a very homely room. Just as quickly, he found himself outside again. His basket of wares was empty of all his crockery, but 5 gold sovereigns lay there instead. A woman in Sandness died as she was giving birth. Her widower eventually remarried, and life carried on. One day he chanced to be passing by Stawborough Hill. A door was there where there should have been none. Not believing his own eyes, he saw inside the hill his first wife. She told him that she had been kidnapped by the Trows, and an effigy of herself left in her place at their home. It was this effigy that had been buried. She told him not to eat any food or drink while he was inside the hill with her, and so he refused every single morsel that he was offered. This angered the Trow whose hill it was, and he hit the man soundly on his ear. From that day forwards until the end of his days, the man was deaf in that same ear. On Shetland, in the parish of Walls, lived a crofter, a farmer of a tiny traditional farm, a small holding of the Isles. He was returning to his homestead one day when he saw a group of Trows carrying a large bundle of something. When he got to his cottage, he realised that the bundle had been his wife. The Trows had kidnapped her. An effigy in her likeness stood in her place, a false mimic. He grabbed hold of this false woman and threw it on the fire. At that the thing rose in the air and went right out of the roof in a puff of smoke. As this happened, his own dear wife came rushing back to the cottage and through the door. The Trows never bothered that croft again. There is a tale told by a woman of the Isle of Unst how she saw what she believed were the Trows when she was a very small child. She was playing with her friends in an abandoned house when the place before her was filled with small creatures. On one side they were black-coloured and on the other white. They flew at each other in a great fight. The children clung to each other, watching the strange beings fighting for what seemed an age. After a time, the black ones seemed to just disappear. The white ones stayed just that little longer. After everything had vanished, the terrified children picked themselves up and ran back to their homes. She had never forgotten that day in all her life. In Skerries, on the slope of Blurry Hill, near Michael Beattie's Cove, lived Michael Beattie himself. This was known as a place where Trows lived. One fine day, Mrs. Beattie was baking the thick traditional oatcakes known as brownies. She left the room but a moment, and on returning, found that one of her brownies was missing. This same thing happened over and over, much to her annoyance, and on telling her husband, much to the puzzlement of Michael. He decided to investigate who was the thief. So, one evening after his wife had been baking another batch of brownies, he hid in the shadow in a corner, unseen by all. He watched his wife leave the room. To his complete astonishment, one of the hearthstones lifted slowly, and from the gap crept the hand of a trow. It pattered around and found the fresh baking. It grabbed a brownie, and the hand disappeared back under the stone. The stone closed right down after it. There was a woman living on Shetland who was approached by a little trow wife. The trow asked, could she borrow some cornmeal from the lady? Of course the woman did just this. It was no problem at all. A few days later, the little trow wife returned to give her back the same amount of meal. This was the best of the best, though, milled from only the very tips of the ears of the wheat. The woman's husband had known this would happen, as while he was drying the corn in the fields, him and the other workers had noticed a change at the trowie knowe, a strangeness. Really, there are just so many trow sighting tales, and from all ages and eras as well, and so much folklore about the trow folk. However, we have to end this episode somewhere, so let's end it here. In the Scots magazine, there was a tale from 1964. A man walking along the cliff tops at Torness saw the Trows. He said he watched in amazement as he saw a sight he could not understand to this day. He had the company of about 12 or so wild-looking men, small, feral, and they were dancing wildly to and fro. He remembered that the creatures did not have long noses, and they had an atmosphere of not being kindly disposed to him being there at all. Their faces were round, they had sallow-looking skin, they had long lank hair that was bedraggled. They danced about and seemed to throw themselves off the cliff. The witness had an instinctive feeling that he had seen a ritual dance of something very primitive and tribal. The Isles of Scotland are a stunning place, somewhere I would love to visit, and friends who have visited say that once you have been, the experience stays with you forever, and there's always a pull to return. Maybe one day we will. It would be an interesting thing indeed to visit the home of Trows and Trow wives and explore with respect for this ancient race. Meantime, and once again, dear friends, we reach the end of our snippet of folklore. So with that, I say as I always do, keep well, brightest of blessings, and remember, don't play with the fairy folk, or you may end up in one of my folk tales yourself.